Global warming, climate change. We're told it's a problem. The scientists are virtually unanimous that there's a problem, so why not fix it? In fact, there are some reasons that some people think we shouldn't fix it. And you might be surprised to find out that it's largely the greedy, egomaniacal, power-hungry people that want to... Oh wait, we won't be surprised at all, really. Today, Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything. Let's talk a little bit about context. I'm going to pronounce his name incorrectly. I want to say Savant, or Savante, August Arrhenius. He's a Swedish scientist, long since passed away. First a physicist, then a chemist. He received the Nobel Prize in 1903. That tells you something about his job resume. He's got some kind of credentials as far as being a scientist is going, Nobel Prize. He was one of the first, or the first as I understand it, to estimate how carbon dioxide was responsible for the increasing of surface temperatures just on Earth. Obviously on Earth, but what does that mean? How much is it happening? Is it happening at all? His belief was, yes, it was happening, that basically there was something to do with greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere messing things up. 1896. That conversation is happening in 1896, that there's something to do with something in the atmosphere having an effect on the Earth, and we need to think about it. So this is not 2009, this is not 1989, this is 1896, a long time ago. A little more context, you know about some of these big companies. An example is ExxonMobil. Well, how has ExxonMobil responded? Because it has a lot of money, it has deep pockets. How has it responded to the claims of so many that what it's doing is contributing to the destruction of the planet? You can research this, don't take my word for it, but this is the general outline in 30 seconds kind of deal. Between the 70s and 80s, ExxonMobil was responsible for hiring some scientists. These scientists basically agreed, yes, there's a problem, we need to pay attention to this. Fossil fuels, when they get used, even bringing them up from the earth, it creates all kinds of these bad gases and these products that we don't like, that aren't very good, and it hurts the environment. And it hurts the environment in a way that will hurt human beings. This is the story, you've heard it before. But after the 1980s, ExxonMobil suddenly spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to convince people that that was not the case. Think about that for a moment. They know, because of the people they've hired, their own in-house group of scientists, they know, but they do the opposite. That is, they act in the opposite way of health. They act in the opposite way of good stewardship. More than just acting against what they know to be true scientifically, they go out of their way to influence public opinion. You're not surprised by this, I know, but we're talking millions of dollars to fund organizations, think tanks, meant to lie. Meant to spin people. And one of the key ways that they spin people, like, can you imagine a person, just kind of being spinny? It throws you off balance, right? To be spinny, to be like, disequilibrium, I'm not really sure what's going on. But one of the ways to do that is to convince people that the science isn't settled. There's still an openness. And the moment you can say there's an openness, that it's not absolute, that it's not 100%, then people start to think, oh, well then really I don't need to act on it. If it's not 100% sure that cigarettes cause cancer, then I can just keep smoking a little bit, because they're not 100% sure. If they're not 100% sure that speeding over the speed limit is dangerous and it increases my risk, well then I'll just keep doing it. It's a very poor form of thinking, it's very counterintuitive, and it leads into the larger question of, well, how does science actually work? Do we expect scientists and science just generally, and the many forms of science, to be absolute and 100%? No, and it's kind of weird that we would expect that. It's almost as if we've set up the sciences to be these gods that are absolutely right every time. And the moment they make a mistake, we jump all over them and say they're discreditable and therefore we don't have to listen to them. That's an odd way to live. If we treated human beings like that, we couldn't get along with anybody. Of course, science is supposed to have a higher bar. It has a lot of money filtering through it or flowing through it. It has layers of mechanism and technique. All kinds of methods in the different sciences, from the physics, biology, chemistry. meant to get human beings closer to nature. But we know human beings make mistakes. That is just part of the deal. So when a company like Exxon pushes this idea of an unsettled science, it's not a genuine attitude of we need to make things better. It's an attitude of dismissiveness and condoning of the practices that they're making billions off of. And it couldn't be clearer. I feel like I'm belaboring the point, but it's unfair to science and the scientists. It's unfair to climate scientists specifically, and it's incredibly unfair to the rest of us in society that the propaganda still flows. That because it's not 100%, I mean, honestly, how close to sure can you get? The scientists seem to be there. About as close as you can get to being sure, it's a real problem. Come on, Exxon. I don't think anyone's really surprised that politicians, big businesses, we don't want to lump them all into the exact same group, but people in power, people making money, wealthy people, no one's really surprised that they lie. They use the propaganda machine to get us to think certain things about certain ways of living and being, and so they can make more money. Nobody's really surprised about that. Okay, fine. But that has widespread implications, not just that we're kind of numb to that, but widespread implications in terms of the actual mechanism of making a tangible difference, a tangible change to things. So let's discuss Naomi Klein and her work, This Changes Everything. Klein has written a number of works. She became famous probably mostly for No Logo, interesting book on branding. And most recently, actually she has another book out, but more recently, 2015, I believe, This Changes Everything. The major problem she tries to address is this economic one. Her argument is that people who deny climate change, so there are people who think the science isn't sound. There are some people who think that maybe it's not a good idea, even if the science is sound. But she's going after people who largely, she thinks these are the bulk of people, who deny climate change, and they're not being irrational. They may actually agree that the earth is burning and we need to do something about it, but they're making a rational choice in favor of their own economic advantage, and so they need to deny climate change as one means of securing their own economic advantage or profit. So it's not that the science is actually unsettled. It's not that they're confused about what the science is saying. It's not even that they think maybe it's impossible and we can't do anything about it anyway, so we might as well just keep burning fossil fuels. It's that they're making money, and they like money. So they lie, they cheat, they steal, and here we are. Okay. There's another group of people, and again, we're generalizing here, but there's another group of people that she looks at, she calls them the warmists, who agree there might be a problem and agree that we should do something about it, but their message is largely one of compromise. So we'll make small incremental changes, maybe a carbon tax here, maybe we'll make sure catalytic converters cost a little more sophisticated on every car, so that the gases that come out of cars is a little cleaner, but we're not going to do anything large scale. So they're trying to find a middle ground. Ultimately, she's going to side on this notion that people who are warmists, that are trying to do a little compromise, are actually not for real change. They're actually making the choice to perpetuate a denial of the situation for what it is so that they can maintain the status quo. Small incremental changes are simply maintaining the status quo. And that is large. So the compromise argument is largely just climate denial, if the situation is as bad as science is telling us. Now I say science singular. Of course, there are many different departments in science, from the chemistry and the biology and the physics and environmental sciences. So that too I'm generalizing. But still, the consensus seems to be there, overwhelmingly so. So what are we talking about? We're talking about changing a system, changing the world, by getting people on board in a way that is fundamentally discomforting, radical, extreme. Climate change needs to be addressed through an extreme response, not just compromise, not incremental change, overwhelming determination and force to fix the situation. So, but why not? Why not change the situation? Well, she goes through a list of some of the reasons why she herself really wasn't tapped into the conversation all that thoroughly. So why was she a climate change denialist in a way? She didn't deny the science, but she didn't treat that truth or that knowledge with a lot of respect or a lot of focus. So here's a few examples that she cites. She in her case, and she thinks it's happening with others, we look for a second, but then we look away. We don't maintain a focus on the issue. There are other issues in life. There are many other pressing problems in life. Most of them probably aren't as important as this one, but still, there are reasons that we can't always focus on it. It becomes overwhelming too. You just need a break. Some people will make it into a joke. Maybe you can point fingers at a certain government or a certain administration and laugh at how bad they are. Sort of half joking, look how ridiculous they're treating the environment, and then you kind of move on. You don't really do anything about it or think anything beyond that. There's a sense for many that there will always be a technological answer. We just have to wait. So if the situation is bad, we'll just wait for the tech companies to come up with some new design. Bill Gates will save us. Somebody out there, a savior complex, they're gonna take care of it. She argues that many of us simply tell ourselves that we're too busy, and in fact we are busy, but we're busy in the wrong direction. She says that many of us tend to just focus on our own lifestyles, sort of an introverted, okay, fine, we do. Many of us will focus on development, make the world better in other ways maybe, or better maybe just in our immediate contexts. These are all different ways in which the energy that should be focused, and rightly should be focused on climate change, gets dispersed, thinned out, misdirected. And at the end of the day, we either forget or it's just maybe it feels too overwhelming. Long story short, here we are. The situation is pretty grim. It requires immediate action, and cultures at large seem either ill-equipped or simply reluctant to really engage in the level of response needed. Well, let's look at some of the specific reasons why they're reluctant to engage, why the responses are always kind of partial, incremental, not very bold often. Why aren't more governments, more people with power, policymakers, people with political advantage, why aren't they doing more? And why are some actually actively acting against this idea of preserving the planet? Like, they're going out of their way to dig up more earth, fracking, looking for oil, doing all kinds of crazy things in the name of profit, when the overwhelming consensus of experts, again, I'm not a scientist, I'm taking their word for it, the overwhelming majority of them say this is a problem that needs to be addressed now. What's going on there? One of the excuses that people are saying, oh no, we can't do this, is the cost. It simply costs too much. How are we going to change every car to an electric car? How are we going to change all of our hydro production? How are we going to, and so on and so on. And it's true, that would be incredibly expensive. That would be very, very costly. But this amounts to saying there's not enough money. There's simply not enough money to go green. Is that the case? Is it true there's not enough money? Many developing nations, in fact, are heavily indebted. They're having a hard time because on the one hand, they need to burn fossil fuels for energy, and they need to be producing things in a way that's not 100% green, in many cases not even close, because they don't have large amounts of resources. So they're doing their best to get by. Unfortunately, those same countries are being the most impacted by pollution and the results of these unfortunate practices. But consider the larger, very rich nations. In the case of the US, after the Second World War, just a few numbers now, there was this thing called the Marshall Plan. You can look it up on Wikipedia, the Marshall Plan, in which the US gave $135 billion in today's money to Western European economies after the Second World War. Here's $135 billion to fix up your economies. Not a loan, not an investment. Well, it was an investment in a way, but $135 billion. Wouldn't that be nice if somebody just gave us $135 billion today? Well, that's just a taste. Consider the 2009 American Recovery Act. Somewhere almost about $831 billion, close to $1 trillion, Obama was able to find and the Senate approved after the huge housing crisis. Again, we've talked about this and you can find a lot of documentation on it. But Wall Street greed and banking greed and all kinds of odd things came into this, but it was basically corruption. And the government found $1 trillion, almost $1 trillion. All right, well, that's good. We could do a lot of environmental initiatives and green projects with $1 trillion. COVID hits, and the Senate sends out in the US over $2 trillion. Over $2 trillion. And yesterday, they announced over another trillion, 1 trillion more. So they're well over at this point, $3 trillion. Have you ever tried to count to 100? I hope you have. 1,000? Have you ever tried to count to 100,000? You could if you were determined. Now try counting to 1,000,000. You're going to lose track. You're going to get tired. Now count to 1 billion. Good luck. 1 trillion is a real number. We understand it's a number. We understand it has a name. But the sheer volume of how many dollars that is really outside of, for most of us at least, our comprehension. 1 trillion. And now we're talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. You're telling me that if we hadn't invested that money, obviously we need to do something about COVID and economies after the Second World War, and in the fear of Great Recession, we need to do these things. But there was money there before, long before COVID, the money was there, and before the Second World War, the money was there. We can invest. There is money. So don't let anyone, this is an optimistic message now, don't let anyone tell you it's too costly, there's no money. That's garbage. Not just the US, but in Canada. Canada is the third largest oil repository on the planet. We have a lot of wealth in Canada, and the question is, what should we do about it? Should we be digging it up? Is it a responsible thing to do? We're already a rich nation. Do we need to be investing, maybe, and in Canada, billions of dollars have flowed, billions, not trillions, billions of dollars have flowed because of things like COVID. So the money was there. Yes, there's debt. There's always debt somewhere. The question is, what is your priority? What are you willing to go into debt for? If you're going into debt for military you don't use, that's problematic, but okay. If you're going into debt for a house that's too big, it's probably not a great idea. You're going into debt for a sports car you really couldn't afford, that's not good debt. Going into debt to save the planet is probably universally a good form of debt. I was told very young, some debts are good and some are bad. Good debts would be like student loans. If you get a degree, certain amount of debt of course, but if you get a degree, that is an asset that will serve you throughout your entire life. Bad debts are like credit card debt, where you buy shoes you can't afford or something that you really don't need. Go out and buy stainless steel drawers. I was really torn over getting these. Obviously, that's a bad kind of debt. Don't let anyone tell you going green costs too much. That's garbage. Klein is very concerned that going green and the current economic interests of the world are in conflict. So she looks at this idea of deregulated capitalism or neoliberalism. These are just names for the way the systems work right now, neoliberalism. And in this case, neoliberalism, neo, new, and liberalism, liberté, not equality or fraternité, but liberty, the neo-liberty of the neoliberalism is you can do anything you want with your money. You want to bury your money in the backyard? Go for it. You want to spend your money on marshmallows? Go for it. There's a certain amount of regulation involved where you have to spend a certain amount in tax dollars, you have to spend it in a certain way, and there's corruption and things like that become a problem. But by and large, under the neoliberal model, the philosophy is people are free to do what they want with their money. In truth, that's not the case at all. Neoliberalism has set up certain other rules that favor people in a certain way while saying everybody's free. Consider if 90% of the wealth belongs to 1% of the world's population, are the rest of us really free to compete with them in an equal way? I mean, that's just one example of, obviously, the system is not free. You can't do anything you want with your money if you don't have any money, right? Okay, that's a little off topic. So she's saying economic advantage, profit, just the way the system currently works, whether it's inherently evil or not, that's a different value claim, and climate change response, responding to the crisis. These are inherent conflict. And we've seen this with other people in the course, like Bookchin, right back in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, he was recognizing this was going to be an issue. So in other words, income inequality, that same disparity of the group of people with less and less and the group of people with more and more, and I don't know where you are on it, but there's this growing disparity. The numbers are there, the stats are there, feel free to research it. That same growing disparity, or that paradigm, matches on to the global response to people with money and wealth, like money and wealth, and they're surprisingly opposed to any kind of climate response. Because any kind of policy change, any kind of change to the status quo business model threatens them making more money. Now they've already got most of the money, but genuine responses to the environmental crisis in which we are situated threaten their status quo. So let's talk about that. To get a better sense of what neoliberalism might be, let's look at 3 ways in which this might have an impact. This is all Klein looking at these things. First, there's a privatization of the public sphere. The public sphere is things owned by a government. So when I was young, the hydro company was owned by the local government, or the provincial, Ontario, federal governments all owned transportation hubs, the roads, the highways. Healthcare is still largely owned. It's not a privatized system. But in other countries, private corporations, many of them are run in healthcare. In Ontario now, one of the major highways, or at least one of, I think maybe 2 now, there are highways that are owned by private corporations. Even the hydro is being developed, is being pushed into the sphere of privatization. What does that mean? The governments get to sell these assets off that were owned by Canadians. So they get to sell off these assets. The argument there is that it makes it more efficient, because when people are in it for profit, private companies, they're more likely to do it in a streamlined way that gets the result that you want. By contrast, people who are paid government salaries, they're kind of bulky and bloated, and the responsibility of the employees that are working for the government that own, say, hydro, their responsibility is a quality product, but a very expensive product. So if you want to save money, sell this stuff off. The governments make money, then corporations come in and they get to run the place. Fine. Except, is that how it works? Are companies that take over, say, Ontario Hydro, really interested in the same level of quality, or are they interested in efficiency so that they can make more profit by lowering quality of service? We've seen this time and time and time again, that the privatization of something, when this free market neoliberalism takes hold and these companies start making products, they're not interested in the best quality product. They're interested, and they're largely legally responsible, obviously, for making a profit. They can't not make profit. That's their design. The stakeholders, the shareholders, the people would have legal recourse if CEOs are going out of their way to lose money. But that's, again, the whole structure of the paradigm of neoliberalism. It's designed to disfavor initiatives towards quality. And what about the larger social implications of governments having less and less control over these major tools of society? If the governments have less and less control over hydro and the transportation hubs, and let's say they've sold off healthcare wherever you are, the governments have less and less reach. And the moment that happens, it makes it very hard for them to have green initiatives where they could leverage hydro, they could leverage the transportation hubs, they could do these things large scale, because they simply don't have the same kind of impact or control over them they once did. What does have control over them? That reigning religion of profit, a greater and greater margin of profit, the bare minimum quality, the bare minimum service. I mean, let's be honest, you can't even call your telephone company without realizing that the service is subpar. Doing what they can to get by with the absolute minimum. That is not how you gear up a society to deal with a major climate change, or any real crisis for that matter. The second thing she talks about is the deregulation of markets. To deregulate means fewer laws. Well, at least that's what it's supposed to mean. As I've already mentioned, in fact, under the neoliberal, there's a lot of new laws coming in, but by and large, okay, let's say that they're deregulating. That's just another way of saying government's hands off. Take your hands off CEOs. Take your hands off, Microsoft. Just let them do their thing. It's kind of in a way, a social Darwinianism. It's survival of the fittest. You just let everybody compete in that competitiveness between different forms of business means some will rise because they have a good quality product and others will fall because they're not very good at their jobs. Whether you're making socks or you're making computer programs, the competitiveness is supposed to result in a good quality product and fair exchange. Right? So if somebody's a liar or a cheat, well, then other companies won't want to deal with them. They'll go out of business. So you don't need rules, you don't need laws. Governments are notorious for having too much red tape, acting too slow, making poor decisions, so just keep the governments out. Deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. Sure, there are laws for taxation and ethics commissions, all these different sorts of things that get involved to make sure people are playing fair. But that's the goal. Problem. What if people aren't behaving? What if the deregulation that is supposed to provide freedom to all has actually equipped the select few to monopolize the whole system? And we're always hearing about monopolies of this kind of company being too big and that kind of company being too big and this company buying out this other company that was, a little small fish. And then they corner the market. The bigger you get, the more power you have, the less competition you have. Really, who's in competition with Google? Who's in competition with Facebook? I mean, they have other platforms, but nobody's really in competition with companies like this. All right? But more than that, when the governments take their hands off more and more and more and just let people kind of do their own thing with the expectation that they'll be responsible adults and that the competitive atmosphere will sort of level itself out, then they can't really have the laws to enact large-scale green reform. Because they've stood back, they let things go, then how do they actually affect change? Klein's argument is that the response needed to the situation is so serious that only governments can have the kind of reach needed to force change. I don't know about you, but I want to believe people will do the right thing. I want to believe people are decent human beings. So when governments deregulate, they take the laws away, the policies, they take away the rewards and punishment, they just back off, that there would be a natural symbiosis or harmony or something created through business in which people could be freely treated and the freedom of the free market could flourish. I want to believe that. That's not what's happened. That is definitely not what's happened. If you don't, if you're looking for an example, if you're just turn on the news tonight and you're going to hear about some sort of wild inequality, financially speaking, wild inequality politically speaking. In other words, the deregulation has not led to the kind of utopian society that anyone had hoped for. Another problem with this, again, is that the governments don't have the power to do what they need to do. Number 3, the lowering of corporate taxes. You've seen it before, you've heard it before. Governments want to keep companies in their country. You charge too much, they'll just go to another country, set up shop, and they'll do business there. And that's not good for countries, obviously. But how low is too low? And given that the governments only spend the money, or they're supposed to, spend the money they have without going into greater debt, when you stop asking for money from these big businesses, Amazon, you can't spend that money. Sure, many countries go into heavy debt loads, but that's not the way it's supposed to be. What happens is that when you cut corporate taxes, you then have to cut social programs. You have to cut things that matter to human beings. And that's based on that neoliberal philosophy. Keep the corporations happy, everybody else will be happy. That's not working out that way. It is clearly not working out that way. When 3/4, I've heard up to 3/4, at least 2/3-ish, 3/4 of the people getting the benefits in the US, the COVID benefits, are making more money on $600 a week, so $2,400 a month kind of thing. They're making more money on that than they were on their jobs. So the Senate, when it just announced its new $1 trillion, was quite concerned about that because they want people to go back to work. They weren't concerned about the fact that people were living on $2,400 a month. They're more concerned that they're de-incentivized because of a minimum emergency benefit is more than they were making. These people need more than $2,400 a month. Have you ever tried to pay for a car, pay for an education, pay for a house, pay for food? As a student, I got by. I had pretty heavy debt load when I got out. Now, just the minimum, $2,400? You're missing the perspective here, Senate. When people are that impoverished that they'd rather take that instead of going back to work, you're missing the wrong idea. You're missing the wrong thing. But that too is a part of that neoliberal perspective, where to generate funds, to generate a healthy society, it's about getting people to work, even if the work is meaningless, even if it's not rewarding, and even if it keeps them in relative destitution. That's weird, but it works for the rich. That way of thinking works for the rich. In Klein's thinking, if we're making a choice, and we do have to make a choice between favoring the corporations or favoring the underdog, that choice speaks volumes. And if you're choosing the corporations and corporate agenda welfare, obviously you're not helping the planet. That's problematic. And to push, again, for this compromise overlooks the radical difficulty of the situation. So trying to find a middle ground here, I don't like that binary perspective myself. You have to pick this or you have to pick that. That very much becomes something like a false dichotomy to me. Well, is there no middle ground? Is there no fourth, third, fifth alternative? And sometimes you really do have two main options. And in this case, I'm partially persuaded that there does seem to be, in fact, just two main options. And that compromise is simply choosing the option of not changing. Klein looks at this question, who's denying it? Who specifically? What's the demographic of people who are denying climate change? And she's not doing this to call them out as an enemy, as we saw with Hooks and so many others. It's not about making people bitter, contrite, reactionary, hostile. That's not the point of this. But it's important to know, to make sense of, why are certain values taking predominance over what I would argue is common sense. Between 2007 and 2011, just that that's kind of a narrow band of years, but climate change denial has been on the rise. Why is that when science has been really clear on the topic for quite a long time? Well, we can thank companies like Exxon, who have pushed in their own interests, obviously, lied to us shamelessly. Okay. We can also thank the political divide. It's important to consider people's values. Now, this is where it gets tricky. Value, or subjective feeling, or cultural beliefs, are not supposed to impact scientific truth. And again, global warming is a scientific question. Is it happening? What can we do to fix it? But we're human beings, so our values are always with us when we're doing science, thinking about science, even for scientists. They're not robots. But when the average person on the street feels free to dismiss scientific truth, that it seems to be overwhelmingly clear, they feel free to dismiss it because of their own political leanings, because of their color of their skin, we'll talk about this, because of their economic standing. That's a problem. And to reverse, well, there's a lot of ways we can think about reversing, but just acknowledging that that might be the case is a big step forward to combating or tackling this issue of climate change. That it's not necessarily the money, there's lots of money. It's not necessarily the technology, we have a pretty good idea how to fix it. That the real problem might be personal value systems or belief systems that are selfish, narrow-minded. I know these are negative terms, but that may be the biggest problem to fixing the world. Klein looks at this, the US and Canada, and again, these are stats you can look up. The conservative side deny climate change in the US and Canada roughly 3/4 of the time. So if you're conservative, probably 3/4 of your cohort say no to climate change. By contrast, the liberal side, and those numbers change depending on where you are and stuff. The liberal side is about 1/4. So if you're a liberal, your group, your cohort, about 1/4 of you, that's huge. From 3/4 to 1/4, and we can divide it kind of down the middle. Again, people live a spectrum. People aren't necessarily pure conservative, pure liberal. We all have views that kind of go across. We're generalizing. And Klein is pointing out that these two generalities of belief or value systems tell us a lot about how people are responding to the current scientific and environmental crisis. Klein looks at the Yale team. I believe they were called the Cultural Cognition Project. Don't quote me on that. And they looked at this idea of, quote, what they call, quote, cultural worldview, end quote. And Klein picks up on this idea that political leanings, ideological outlook, these are the strongest indicators of what people will think of in terms of the climate. Not their science background, not the current scientific literature, not the climate scientists. No. Where were you born? What's your religion? Are you white? Are you Republican? Are you Democratic? What are you? And then I can pretty much tell you what you're going to think about the environment. Huh? That is the cart before the horse. That is upside down, backwards in so many different ways, and yet it seems to be true. You can predict how entire segments of society will think about the environment, not by actually asking them, check this box, climate change is a problem you think we should address, but by checking the other boxes regarding where they are in the liberal conservative spectrum, socioeconomic status, and whatnot. That is not how this is supposed to work. Generalizing again, but we have these two general lists of traits or characteristics that we can assign to liberal conservative side. Not to make the other person an enemy, but to try and get a better sense of how they're thinking and why they're thinking what they're thinking. And the liberal side, they tend to be more egalitarian, more communitarian. They value collective action. Again, this is generally mostly collective action. Social justice. They're concerned about inequality, and they're suspicious of corporate behavior. You might not agree. I don't know that I agree with all of those, but that seems to be pretty close, generally speaking. The conservative side values a hierarchy, which would explain the love of Trump worship in a way. They're individualistic, individual freedom, right? They're patriotic in a sense of my country, but very individualistic. That's the source of the initial freedom. They're against government support for poor and minorities. I to this day can't get my head wrapped around that, but every time Mitch McConnell stands up, I seem to hear that from him. Maybe I'm wrong. And the support for industry. Love industry. And basically the philosophy of we get what we deserve. So on the one side, liberal side, egalitarian, communitarian, pushing for this idea of collective action, social justice, suspicious of corporate power. On the other side, we value hierarchy, more individualistic, government support for minorities, not a big fan of that, or the poor, don't really like that. And again, it goes back to this whole idea that the most recent COVID funding at the US Senate is concerned that people making $2,600 a month will be de-incentivized to work. Yikes, that's a clear example of that. All right, if these are even partially true, let's say they're 60% true on both sides, well, probably closer to 75 or 80%, but let's say they're partially true, then map on what would it take to address climate change? What sort of action and initiatives and values correlate with saving the planet? And it seems pretty obvious that the liberal side, which is why 3/4 of them agree climate change is a problem and needs to be acted on, the liberal side is positioned to take it more seriously. Not necessarily for all world problems. Not all world problems get the same solution. In many contexts, the more conservative hierarchical side might take dominance. The individualistic, they might have strategies for addressing certain issues in the world that are helpful. But in terms of the environment, the liberals take a clear win, not just because they agree it's a problem and they want to do something about it. Their very value system, how they see the world, maps on to the needed response, the needed thinking about the environment. The easiest way to frame this is who's in favor of neoliberalism the most, liberals or conservatives. Obviously the conservatives come out far ahead with the neoliberal perspective. And what's the problem with the neoliberal perspective? Everything we've talked about in terms of inequality, deregulation, privatization, and so on. Everybody has the propensity to say no to things that are uncomfortable. Everybody can deny scientific truth, scientific fact. Everybody can, even the things in front of me, no, this is not a highlighter. We can all say no to the things that are self-evident to others. We all fall into that category. But when your value system is constantly convincing you to ignore a pressing real-world problem, how do you overcome that? How do you even begin to see that it is an actual problem when the very lenses you're wearing are conditioning you to dismiss it and to say no? When your interests for money or whatever want you to say no to it, how do you get past that? How do you find the courage, the wherewithal, the bravery to punch through those value systems and to live the world for what it is? This is an ancient question. This is nothing new. This is an ancient question. And again, it's not a question of scientific knowledge. It's not a question of can we afford to do it or do we have the technology. These are value system questions about people who simply have made the rational choice. I'm less interested in the world and I'm more interested in my immediate economic advantage or following the people around me in their pursuit of economic advantage. If I can be a bit more confrontational now, there are two conservative myths that Klein looks at. Values that she looks at. The first is that the magic of the free market will save us. Big business is the key to success. Oh my gosh, if I hear Trump say that one more time and everything he exudes of big business will save us, big business will save us. At this point, what more do we need to know that that's not the case? That is simply not the case. Number two is the conservative belief, some liberals might hold this to, but it's largely conservatives, that it's the right of humans to take dominion over nature. Nature is ours to do what we want. Hence, this is an interesting stat, conservative white males are 6 times more likely to deny climate change. Please look that up. Conservative white males are 6 times more likely to deny climate change? Why? Because they read the science. No. Why? Because their personal values and interests conflict with it. It is inconvenient. It doesn't align with their world ambitions, and so they say no. Plus, conservative white males have a little bit of this, cha-ching. They can afford to build houses that will resist the wind. They can afford to live in places that won't have the immediate consequences of global warming felt up front. Those will be some of the state here, country there. But me, I'll be fine at least for the next 30, 40 years. Therefore, to hell with everybody else. So goes the reasoning. In her book, The Shock Doctrine, another quite popular book, she looks at the ways governments help private corporations profit off of natural disasters and wars. I know this sounds like a conspiracy theory. To some, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. To others, it's just common sense. Yeah, of course, companies will benefit. They'll thrive off of that. Bomb Afghanistan, then companies can go in, buy up what's left maybe, or just rebuild housing and make a fortune. Anyway, big business in death. So this is the darker side now of global warming, that if it's real, it's a business opportunity. When crops start drying up, we're going to get climate refugees, where the locals living in a local community who were once self-sufficient now can't survive because they can't figure out, or they don't have the mechanisms or the devices to bring water in because drought is hurting their crops. So they can't afford to keep their crops alive. So they're going to have to leave. Companies will buy up those crops. Of course, they have the industry and the means of bringing in water resources, so they get the land cheap. Now they have crops. They bring in genetically modified crops, having genetically modified crops that resist drought. Of course, they can afford to do all of this. It's a win-win-win for the people who already have it all. Climate refugees, entire nations' cultures might be wiped out because they can't compete. And so they have to move into urban slums. They're forced to live in places that are not their homes, that they become the new poor, right? That other countries, of course, will have to work with, deal with, help, if at all possible, while those who have the means that were already thriving continue to thrive. Maybe, unless we do something about it now. Of course, this is happening in many respects. The flooding, the coastal waters, we're going to see this sooner and sooner, where the coastal waters start pushing people back. And in many impoverished or developing nations, a lot of those coastal plains that are going to flood, where are those people going to go? What are they going to do? Because those countries aren't rich enough. There's going to be a worldwide crisis, economically speaking, for some. Who? The poor. And this is the message we get time and time again, where it's the poor that suffer, not the rich. They can do almost anything they want, and they don't suffer. All right, so what do? Let's say for the moment that we get a willing ear, a listening ear, that these conservative white males suddenly come around. They're like, yeah, okay, maybe I do want to have a conversation about this. What do I do? When they realize that there is money, when they realize there's a will that many people do want to change, then there's what are the practical things that we might do? Klein comes up with a number of them. Here's just a few, some of the big ones. Let's do sweeping bans on polluting activities. Just ban polluters. That's not that hard to do. I mean, it's obviously complicated in a way. You got to come up with some rules and implement the rules, and you have to have some sort of structure to punish, reward, and punishment. Okay. Deep subsidies for green alternatives. People want to do something good. Governments should be handing out money. Yeah, hand out the money. $1,000 here, $1 million there. It sounds crazy, but we can still incentivize with money. Money can still be the catalyst to changing the economy. It's just rethinking how that money is changing hands. Pricey penalties for violations, of course. When somebody does something wrong, de-incentivize through money. New taxes, you've heard a lot about this. When people hear new taxes, they start screaming socialism, or they start thinking totalitarianism, fascism, or all these different names. Listen, we're all being taxed. It's just a question of where are the tax dollars going? And I should take that back. We're not all being taxed. The people with the most amount of money are not. And Klein's going to argue that we need to close down the tax havens where the billionaires and the billionaires send their money to countries where the governments that they live in can't see it, so they don't get taxed on them. That by itself would be billions of dollars. People simply paying their rightful share that they're otherwise hiding. Other things she suggests, new public works programs, fine. Reversals of privatization, definitely. The elephant in the room is always in the room. We need to force fossil fuel companies to change their behavior. CO2, unacceptable. Major greenhouse gas, it needs to be stopped. Well, how do we do that? Governments have to do that. And how do we get governments to do that? We have to convince them through lobbying, through voting, through popular discourse, just talking about it, through protests, all these different ways in which the polluter ends up paying. The polluter ends up paying. After all, the logic is simple. Polluters have made money by exploiting the natural resources at their disposal and harming the environment as a consequence. Fine. Well, if you're going to do that, well, it's not fine, but if you're going to do that, then you have a disproportionate responsibility, and so you're going to have a disproportionate tax bill to the point that it de-incentivizes doing that so that you find alternative technologies. That's what carbon taxes are designed to do. It's not just a tax so that these companies can continue to do what they're doing. It's to de-incentivize these companies from doing what they're already doing and then try to get them to come up with new technologies. Carbon taxing has a lot of many layers to it that people don't seem to appreciate. But also part of this CO2 fossil fuel rethinking scenario, Klein argues that there should be a heritage fund set up so that higher royalty rates are feeding into a global fund so that countries that don't have a lot of money can tap into this fund to then do new green initiatives, whatever those might be. This surprised me. I didn't realize that the US military was the #1 CO2 producer in the world. The US military. So this great juggernaut of aircraft carriers and planes and all these different things. The #1 CO2 contributor. And it basically sits idle and good, and it, by most accounts, is far larger than it needs to be. But let's say, keep the military the way it is, volume-wise, but invest, say, $3 trillion, $5 trillion in making that fleet a green fleet. Electronic airplanes, I don't know, drones that don't have fossil fuels, they're just hybrids or something like that. Now we're talking. You don't have to be afraid that your military is going to disappear. You simply invest in transforming it. Klein offers some specifics, she thinks, to the tune of about $2.4 trillion. Specific ways or things we can do to make trillions of dollars. One of the big ones at the very top is a low-rate financial transaction tax. So this is a tax that you and I wouldn't pay. It would be a tax that market speculators or people who engage in the stock market would pay, and they wouldn't even really notice it, probably. It'd be like less than 1%, and it would generate a profound amount of income. Closing tax havens, as already discussed, is huge. Just getting people to pay the taxes that they should be paying already. Don't even increase taxes, just get the money that you're supposed to be getting from them would be huge. A 1% billionaire tax. You're a billionaire? Pay 1% extra. 1%, one, not 5, not 10, not 25, not 80%, just 1%. And the neoliberals freak out. They lose their minds. heaven forbid, they pay 1%. It's not an unreasonable request. In fact, I would argue it's unreasonable in the opposite direction, which is it's too small. 1% isn't nearly enough. But still, here we are. Of course, you can slash military budgets. That'll give you trillions and trillions, or billions, whatever you're doing. CO2 carbon tax, that's a good one. Get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. On her list, this is by far one of the biggest. Fossil fuel subsidies, where governments pay oil companies to stay in business. Why is this happening? I don't understand why this is happening. I lack the imagination to understand why billions of dollars are being spent to give oil companies an incentive to stay oil companies. Stop doing that. That's weird. They're already making billions of dollars doing the bad stuff they're already doing. I should point out that I'm not naive. And the background that you're watching to this video is of a company behind me tearing up the earth to put in homes. I'm not naive in the sense that I know we need places to live. I know, especially right now, we need fossil fuels. But that's not the argument that we just need to suddenly stop. The argument is we need to rethink how these things are happening, whether it's the home development or whether it's the oil barons. We need to rethink, and we need to rethink, according to Klein, in a regenerative way. That whatever we do, it should have some kind of regeneration to it. And this is all in contrast to what she calls extractivism. Extractivism is a non-reciprocal, dominance-based relationship with the earth, a non-reciprocal dominance base. So we've talked about this in terms of power in other contexts where I have power over you, I get you to do what I want. Well, when that happens with the earth, it has long-term negative repercussions for our survivability. Right? There needs to be a general sense of you and I are interacting, I'm using resources, I'm cutting down trees, but if I'm not replanting, if I'm not thinking long-term about maintaining the area in which I'm cutting down, then I'm not doing that regenerative kind of philosophy. As she sees it, extractivism, this philosophy or thinking about the world, makes life, reduces life, all life, human life, life out there, into a value system in which you either have value or you do not. In the world of extractivism, the thinking is, and tell me if you think this is true of the world, the culture you live in, you matter to me and you have value to me if I can exploit you, if you give me something I want. You don't have value in and of yourself because you're beautiful, because you're human, because you're just nature, because you're biodiversity. Only to the degree that I can extract or take something and turn it into money, or turn into something that then turns into money, or maintains my power, only then would you have value. The classical way of thinking about this is to say utilitarianism. And I would argue that this is the dominant way of thinking about people and the world today. Utility is, if I can use it like a vice, if I can do something with it to get something I want, it's good, it has value. The binary here, as she sees it, is that if you don't, if you're not useful to me, for my ends, whatever those might be, then you become a burden. If I'm my son and I like the idea of mining for gold, panning for gold, not really mining for gold. And some of the terminology they use is overburden. So when you want to find gold, it's a heavier metal, obviously. So you have to get rid of what's on top of it, which is junk. It's useless. It's called overburden. In the philosophy of extractivism, you either have value or you're a burden. And it's a one or the other. There's no middle ground. And if you're not of value, then we don't want you. Go away. You're parasitical, you're a leech, you're the enemy, you're bad in some way. Go, 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 because you're standing in the way of it. That way of thinking about the world is so common to some that they don't even question it. But it is inherently flawed in a number of reasons. First of all, that is such a narrow perspective of value. That is such a narrow way of thinking about how can beauty be valued? If beauty is only what sells a product, you don't understand beauty. Like if beauty is only what gets you something long-term financially or politically, that is such a narrow band of what is possible. It's sad really. And that's the problem with extractivism. It's a very strange way of thinking. It's the dominant way of thinking, but it's also the most damaging. A manifestation of the extractivist philosophy would look something like the Alberta oil sands. Again, I'm not naive. I know we need fossil fuels at this stage. We need to be phasing out faster than we are, but we need fossil fuels. But the Alberta oil sands are an example. Go Google an image of Alberta's oil sands, and what you'll see is a poisoned, scorched earth. Dead. Will probably be dead forever. A necessary evil in some ways, yes, but at that scale and in that way, probably not. And there are a number of ways for saying this is an example of extractivism, where there are these things called sacrificial zones. This is Klein's way of thinking. There are just some places that are worth sacrificing. Not just places, there are some people. Coal miners are an example of people we're willing to sacrifice. Children in sweatshops in Bangladesh are examples of people we're willing to sacrifice. And why do we sacrifice them? Because their value is in being used up. Does this remind you of our other conversations about slavery and colonialism, where the value of people is in their usefulness for getting money? Ouch. So the modern world right now, one of the leading reasons why people are denying the climate is changing isn't that they believe necessarily it's not changing. It's that it doesn't serve their interests of extractivism and using people to make, you know what? You've heard me say it. Money! Another part of the extractivist mindset, and it's really a naive optimism, much like neoliberalism promised a utopian culture that it has not provided, this extractive mindset also promises sort of a utopian way of thinking in which there's always somewhere else to go, that the resources of the earth are infinite. If that's true, then much of our concern for the climate changing is maybe unfounded. We just need to tweak things a little bit. It's not true. The earth is a finite resource. It is a finite resource. And this general optimism that we'll always go somewhere else and we'll always exploit something different, and you know, if we have to, we'll go to another planet. We'll mine the moon. I heard reports the other day that they're talking about mining the moon within the next few years. And you hear this, and it's incredible. It's mind-numbing stupidity. Okay, I'm being bombastic. But really, if you have to go to the moon to mine things, you might be an extractivist. You might be one of the reasons we have problems. And trust me, going to the moon to mine minerals is not going to solve the basic problem here. That philosophy needs to be confronted. That way of thinking, that value perspective, where you're a value or you're a burden, we need to overcome that very simple binary. So to answer my own question, why not just solve climate change? Why not confront it head on? Well, those are some of the reasons why. And they're deep-seated right into the very value system of how we see the world. Let me leave you with this. Pascal's wager. You may be familiar with it. Pascal's kind of a gambling philosophy. Is there a God or isn't there? If there's a God, I probably want to live a certain way. And if there's not a God, well, then I can live any way I want. Okay, but I don't know. Let's say for the moment that the science was unsettled in terms of the climate changing. Let's just say we couldn't know, just like we can't know if there's a God. What is the most logical course of action? To believe in God and to believe in climate change, even though it's not definitive, which is not the case, but even if it's not definitive, or to live as if there is no climate change and there is no God. And he ran through the options, and it's really quite clear, pragmatically speaking or practically speaking, if I live my life believing the science is unsettled, because I believe in ExxonMobil, and if it turns out I'm wrong, we're in a lot of hurt, we're in a lot of trouble. But what if I give the scientific community, or those who say global climate change is a real issue, what if I give them the benefit of the doubt, and I take them seriously and I live my life as if it is a problem? Then I'm protecting my own butt. Does it require sacrifice? Does it require resources? Maybe radical restructuring of society? Yes, it does, but it is the only logical alternative. The Earth is warming and it could be catastrophic. The Earth is not warming. The more logical one is to assume hope for the best, plan for the worst. These are catchphrases, I know, not sound arguments. These are catchphrases. Hope for the best, plan for the worst.